The sharp crack of a gunshot shattered the stillness of the Montana Territory morning, sending a flock of startled birds into flight as Delilah Fontaine gripped the rifle with white knuckles, her dark eyes fixed on the freshly turned earth of her husband's grave. It was 1878, and for the third time in her 26 years, death had stolen someone she loved. The morning dew soaked through her black mourning dress as she knelt beside the crude wooden cross that marked where Thomas had been laid to rest just 2 days prior. Typhoid had taken him quickly, cruelly leaving her alone with a struggling cattle ranch, mountains of debt, and walls built so high around her heart that no man would ever scale them again. "I will never love again," she whispered to the grave, the words a vow as sacred as the ones they'd exchanged before a preacher 4 years earlier. "I cannot survive another loss." The sound of approaching hoofbeats made Delilah quickly wipe her tears away, tucking the rifle under her arm as she rose to her feet. Visitors were rare at the Broken Spoke Ranch, 20 miles from the nearest town of Silver Creek, and uninvited ones were rarely welcome. A tall figure on horseback appeared over the ridge, silhouetted against the rising sun. The rider approached with unhurried confidence, and as he drew nearer, Delilah could make out his features: sandy hair beneath a well-worn Stetson, broad shoulders, and a face weathered by sun and wind. Not the bank agent she'd been dreading, but a stranger nonetheless. "Madam," he called out, tipping his hat as he reined his horse to a stop several yards away, respectful of both her weapon and her grief. "Name's Ethan Quinn. I'm looking for work." Delilah regarded him coldly. "You're wasting your time, Mr. Quinn. This ranch is failing, and I can't afford to hire help." He dismounted with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. "I heard in town that Thomas Fontaine's widow might need a hand. I don't require much payment, just meals and a place to sleep." "And why would you work for so little?" Suspicion edged her voice. "Winter's coming. A roof over my head is worth plenty." His blue eyes met hers directly. "And I've got my reasons for wanting to stay in one place for a spell." "You're running from something." It wasn't a question. A slight smile touched his lips. "Aren't we all, madam?" Delilah's gaze drifted to the cattle grazing in the distance, too few to sustain the ranch through another season, then to the barn that needed repairs, and finally back to her husband's grave. "I've buried a father, a brother, and now a husband, Mr. Quinn. I have no interest in taking responsibility for another soul." She turned toward the small farmhouse. "But you can stay for supper before you move on." Ethan nodded, leading his horse toward the water trough. "Much obliged." By the time darkness fell, Delilah had set a simple meal of beans, cornbread, and coffee on the table. She watched with quiet assessment as Ethan ate with the measured restraint of a man who had known hunger but wasn't driven by it. "These are fine beans, Mrs. Fontaine," he said, breaking the silence. "Miss Fontaine," she corrected automatically. "I was Delilah Frost before I married Thomas. I'll be that again soon enough." "That's so," he raised an eyebrow. "I'm selling the ranch," she said flatly. "Once I find a buyer, I'll move back east to my cousin in Boston." Ethan set down his spoon. "Seems a shame. Good land here." "Good land that requires good men to work it," she replied, "and good men are either dead or not to be trusted. I reckon there might be a few worth keeping around." A hint of humor touched his eyes. "I've yet to meet one who stays," Delilah said sharply. She stood and began clearing the dishes with more force than necessary. "The barn roof won't make it through a heavy snow," Ethan observed, changing the subject. "I could fix that tomorrow before I move on." Delilah paused, practicality warring with her desire to be left alone. "Why would you do that? Call it payment for the meal?" He leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Or maybe I just don't like seeing things broken when they can be fixed." Something in his steady gaze made her uncomfortable. "The shed behind the barn has some tools. You can sleep there tonight if you want. First light, you start on that roof." Ethan nodded. "Yes, madam." Morning came with a crimson streak across the eastern sky, and Delilah woke to the rhythmic sound of hammering. From the kitchen window, she watched Ethan moving confidently across the barn roof, replacing rotted boards with spare lumber she hadn't even known was stored in the back of the structure. By midday, he'd completed the roof and moved on to mending the corral fence. By evening, he'd fixed the broken pump at the well. At sunset, she found him examining the small herd of cattle with a critical eye. "You've been busy," she said, approaching with a canteen of water. He accepted it with a nod of thanks. "Your herd's in rough shape." "Not enough to survive the winter, let alone turn a profit." "I'm aware," she said stiffly. "There's a herd being driven north," he said. "Trail boss is an old friend. They'll be passing 10 miles east in 3 days. Could be they'd sell you a dozen head at a fair price." Delilah laughed without humor. "With what money, Mr. Quinn? Thomas left me land and debt, nothing more." Ethan gestured toward the distant hills. "You've got good grazing land extending into that northern valley. A man with cattle and no land might consider a trade." She studied him. "And how would I know what's fair? I'm just a widow being circled by vultures waiting to take advantage. I could go with you," he offered. "Help negotiate." "Why?" she demanded. "Why help a stranger?" Ethan's gaze traveled over the ranch, then settled back on her. "This place deserves a fighting chance. So do you." For 3 days, Ethan worked from dawn until dusk, repairing what needed fixing, tending the cattle, and chopping enough firewood to last through the first month of winter. Delilah watched him with wary eyes, expecting at any moment to discover his true motives. On the morning of the 4th day, they rode east together to meet the cattle drive. Ethan had borrowed a horse from the small stable, an ornery gelding that Thomas had never fully broken. "You sit a horse well," Ethan observed as they rode side by side across the open prairie. "My father taught me before I could walk," she replied. "He ran the broken spoke before Thomas. Before that, my grandfather built it from nothing." "Family legacy," Ethan nodded. "Worth fighting for." Delilah's jaw tightened. "Worth dying for, apparently. My father was killed in a stampede when I was 16. My brother took over, then died in the war. Thomas was my brother's friend who promised to keep the ranch going." She stared straight ahead. "Now they're all gone, and I'm the last." "Not everyone leaves by choice, Miss Fontaine. Choice or not, the result is the same." Her voice was bitter. "I'm done with loss. Selling the ranch and starting fresh is the only sensible option." They reached the cattle drive by midday. Ethan's friend, a gruff trail boss named Fletcher, greeted them with suspicious hospitality. As promised, Ethan negotiated skillfully, securing 15 healthy cattle in exchange for grazing rights on the northern section of Delilah's property. "You drive a hard bargain, Quinn," Fletcher grumbled as they sealed the deal. "Just keeping things fair," Ethan replied with an easy smile that Delilah had rarely seen directed at her. On the journey back to the ranch, trailing their new cattle, Delilah found herself studying Ethan more closely, the confident way he handled the livestock, his patience with her questions, the quiet competence in everything he did. "Where did you learn ranching?" she asked as they made camp for the night, the cattle settled nearby. "My father spread in Texas," he answered, building a small fire. "Left when I was 19 to make my own way. And have you made your way?" Something like regret crossed his features. "Been drifting mostly." "Working ranches from Texas to Wyoming. Running," she said softly. His eyes met hers across the flames. "Sometimes running is just walking with purpose." The next morning, they awoke to dark clouds gathering on the horizon. They hurried the cattle along, but the storm caught them 3 miles from the ranch. Rain poured down in blinding sheets, and lightning cracked dangerously close. The cattle grew skittish, threatening to scatter, head for that stand of trees. Ethan shouted over the thunder, "We'll wait it out." They managed to herd the cattle into a sheltered grove, but Delilah's horse spooked at a lightning strike, rearing suddenly. She fought to control the animal, but a second bolt sent it bolting. Delilah clung desperately to the saddle as the horse galloped wildly through the driving rain. Then suddenly Ethan was alongside her, reaching across to grasp her reins. Both horses slowed, but Delilah's mount stepped into a hidden hole, stumbling violently. She was thrown forward, tumbling to the muddy ground with a cry of pain. Ethan was at her side instantly. "Are you hurt?" She tried to stand, but collapsed with a gasp. "My ankle." Without hesitation, he lifted her onto his horse and led them to a small abandoned line shack a quarter-mile away. Inside, he gently set her on a crude bench and examined her ankle. "Sprained, not broken," he pronounced. "But you won't be riding for a few days. The cattle will have to wait out the storm, same as us." As the rain hammered the tin roof, Ethan built a fire in the small stove and found a dusty blanket to wrap around her shoulders. He removed his wet shirt to dry by the stove, revealing a lean, muscled torso marked with several scars, including one that looked suspiciously like a bullet wound. "Texas Ranger," Delilah guessed, nodding toward the scar. A shadow crossed his face. "For a time didn't end well." "What happened?" Ethan stared into the flames. "My partner was killed. I couldn't save him. I'm sorry," she said, recognizing the weight of guilt in his voice. "Been riding ever since," he continued quietly. "Taking work where I can find it, trying to outrun memories that won't fade." "Does it work?" she asked. The running, his eyes met hers. About as well as building walls. They fell silent, listening to the storm rage outside. Delilah found herself studying the profile of this man who had appeared from nowhere, who worked without complaint, who looked at her broken-down ranch and saw possibility instead of failure. "Why did you really come to my ranch, Mr. Quinn?" He considered her question for a long moment. "I was in Silver Creek, heard about Thomas passing, heard the bank was circling, waiting to take the land. Seemed wrong." "You didn't know Thomas." "No," he admitted, "but I know what it's like to lose everything you care about." The storm continued through the night. They talked little, but the silence between them grew comfortable. By morning, the rain had stopped, and they returned to find the cattle still gathered in the grove. Over the next 2 weeks, Ethan's temporary stay extended as he helped repair storm damage, tend the expanded herd, and plant a winter garden. Delilah found herself growing accustomed to his presence, the sound of his boots on the porch, his deep voice calling to the horses, the way he always tipped his hat when he saw her. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in brilliant hues, Delilah finally asked the question that had been troubling her. "What will you do when winter comes?" Ethan leaned back in his chair. "Hadn't given it much thought. You should." She kept her eyes on the horizon. "You can't stay here forever." "Why not?" he asked simply. Delilah turned to face him. "Because I'm still planning to sell this place." "Are you?" There was gentle skepticism in his voice. "You haven't mentioned Boston in weeks." "The bank's given me until spring to clear Thomas's debts. By then, I'll need to decide." Ethan nodded slowly. "Well, until then, you could use the help. I can't pay you properly. I'm not asking for payment." Her eyes narrowed. "Everyone wants something, Mr. Quinn." He met her gaze steadily. "Not everything worth having comes with a price tag, Miss Fontaine." The first snow came in early December, blanketing the ranch in pristine white. Ethan had insulated the house and barn, laid in supplies, and ensured the cattle had adequate shelter. The broken spoke was better prepared for winter than it had been in years. On Christmas Eve, Delilah found herself humming as she prepared a special dinner: roast venison from a deer Ethan had hunted, potatoes from her garden, and an apple pie made with preserved fruit. She'd even unpacked the good china that had belonged to her mother. When Ethan came in from the barn, he stopped short at the sight of the decorated table and the small pine tree in the corner, adorned with paper ornaments and candles. "What's all this?" he asked, his expression one of pleasant surprise. "Christmas," she answered simply. "I haven't celebrated properly since Thomas fell ill last year." Something warm flickered in Ethan's eyes. "It looks mighty fine." During dinner, Delilah found herself laughing at Ethan's stories of Christmases past, of his father dressing as Santa, despite his mother's protests. Of the year he and his brothers got lost hunting for the perfect tree, and returned home after dark to find the entire county out searching for them. "Your family sounds wonderful," she said, refilling his coffee cup. A shadow crossed his face. "They were. What happened to them? Fever took my mother and youngest brother when I was 15. Father passed 5 years ago. My other brothers scattered, one to California, one to Colorado." He shrugged. "Family has a way of slipping through your fingers no matter how tightly you hold on." After dinner, Ethan presented her with a small wooden box he'd carved himself. Inside lay a delicate hair comb made from polished bone. "It's beautiful," she whispered, running her fingers over the smooth surface. "Not much of a gift compared to all this," he said, gesturing to the dinner. Delilah shook her head. "It's perfect." That night, after Ethan had returned to the bunkhouse where he'd been staying, Delilah stood at her window watching snowflakes dance in the moonlight. For the first time since Thomas's death, the crushing weight of loneliness had lifted. She touched the comb Ethan had given her, and something stirred in her heart, something she immediately tried to suppress. January brought bitter cold and howling blizzards that confined them to the ranch for weeks. They passed the time with checkers, reading aloud from Delilah's small collection of books and long conversations by the fire. She learned about Ethan's time as a ranger, his dreams of owning land someday, his quiet philosophies on life and loss. In turn, she shared stories of her childhood on the ranch, her brief time at a ladies' school in Denver, and her marriage to Thomas, a partnership of friendship and practicality rather than passion. "You never loved him?" Ethan asked one evening as they sat before the fire, a snowstorm raging outside. "I cared deeply for him," she answered carefully. "But no, not the way stories tell of love. Thomas knew that. He'd lost someone too, a girl back east who died before they could marry. We understood each other's broken hearts." Ethan nodded slowly. "Sometimes understanding is its own kind of love." As winter progressed, Delilah became increasingly aware of Ethan's presence, the breadth of his shoulders as he chopped wood, the gentleness of his hands when he helped her carry supplies, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. It unsettled her, this growing awareness, and she fought against it with renewed determination. One night in February, a wolf pack circled too close to the cattle pens. Ethan and Delilah stood together on the porch, rifles ready as they fired warning shots to drive the predators away. When the danger passed, the relief made them both laugh, and suddenly they were standing too close, the warmth of his body radiating through the cold night air. For one breathless moment, Delilah thought he might kiss her. Instead, he stepped back, tipped his hat, and wished her good night. The next morning, Ethan announced his intention to ride into Silver Creek for supplies. "Weather's cleared. We're running low on flour and coffee." "Be careful," Delilah said, trying to sound casual. "The trail will be treacherous." He mounted his horse with a reassuring smile. "I'll be back by nightfall." But nightfall came with no sign of Ethan. Delilah paced the house, peering anxiously through windows as darkness claimed the land and another storm threatened. By midnight, fear had taken root in her chest. When morning arrived with still no sign of him, she saddled her horse and prepared to search, only to see a rider approaching slowly through the fresh snow. Relief flooded her until she realized it wasn't Ethan but Sheriff Morris from Silver Creek. "Miss Fontaine," the sheriff called, dismounting with a grim expression. "I'm afraid I have news about your ranch hand." Delilah's heart seemed to stop. "What happened?" "There was trouble in town. Quinn got into it with some men passing through rough sorts looking for easy pickings." The sheriff removed his hat. They recognized him from his ranger days, old grudges, it seems. "Is he?" She couldn't finish the question. "He's alive," the sheriff assured her quickly, "but hurt bad. Doc's got him at the clinic in town. Said to tell you he took a bullet defending a woman those men were harassing." Relief and anger warred within her. "I'll need to go to him. Roads are bad," the sheriff warned, "but I can escort you if you're set on it." Within the hour, Delilah was in Silver Creek, rushing into the small clinic where Ethan lay pale and still on a narrow bed, his shoulder heavily bandaged. "You fool," she whispered, taking his hand. "What were you thinking?" His eyes fluttered open, recognition dawning slowly. "Delilah. Who else would come out in a snowstorm to berate you for your recklessness?" She blinked back tears. A weak smile touched his lips. "Couldn't let them hurt her, young mother with a baby. Always the hero," she said, her voice breaking. "Not a hero." He winced as he tried to shift position. "Just a man trying to do right." The doctor insisted Ethan remain in town for at least a week. Delilah arranged to stay at the small hotel, visiting him daily as color gradually returned to his face and strength to his body. During those visits, she learned more about his past, that the men who'd shot him were associates of a murderer he'd brought to justice years ago, and that his drifting had partly been about staying ahead of such dangers. "You should have told me," she said on the 5th day, helping him sit up to drink some broth. "And give you another reason to send me on my way." He shook his head. "Besides, I thought those ghosts were behind me. They found you anyway. They won't again," he said with quiet certainty. "Sheriff wired the marshals. They've been wanted in 3 territories." On the day they finally returned to the ranch, spring was beginning to make itself known. The snow was retreating, revealing patches of mud and the first hints of green. Delilah helped Ethan from the wagon, supporting his weight as they walked to the house. "You should have stayed in town longer," she chided as he sank gratefully into a chair. "Couldn't leave you to manage alone any longer," he said. "Spring's coming, there's work to be done." "You're not doing any work until that shoulder heals properly." Her tone brooked no argument. For 2 weeks, their roles reversed as Delilah tended the ranch while Ethan recovered. She caught him trying to help more than once and scolded him each time. At night, they would sit together by the fire, the domesticity of their arrangement growing more natural by the day. It was during one such evening that Ethan finally spoke the words that had been building between them. "I care for you, Delilah," he said quietly, his eyes steady on hers. "More than I thought possible." She stiffened, panic rising in her throat. "Don't, why not?" he asked gently. "Because I told you from the beginning I will never love again." She stood abruptly, moving to the window. "Everyone I've ever loved has been taken from me. I cannot survive another loss." "That's fear talking," he said, rising to stand behind her. "Not wisdom, it's self-preservation," she countered, "and it's non-negotiable." Ethan's reflection in the window showed his sad smile. "I'm not asking you to love me back, Delilah. I'm just telling you that I love you." She turned to face him, her expression pained. "To what end, what possible future could come of it? I don't know," he admitted, "but I'd like to find out." "I can't," she whispered. "I won't risk my heart again." "Then I'll have to love enough for both of us," he said simply. The declaration hung between them, neither acknowledged nor rejected as the days passed. Spring advanced, bringing new calves to the herd and fresh growth to the fields. Ethan's strength returned fully, and he threw himself into the work of the ranch with renewed vigor. One afternoon in late April, a fancy carriage arrived at the Broken Spoke. A well-dressed man introduced himself as Harrison Wallace, a banker from Helena. "I've come to discuss the sale of your property, Miss Fontaine," he announced, casting an appraising eye over the ranch. "I represent investors interested in consolidating several properties in this valley." Delilah invited him in for coffee, feeling Ethan's silent presence as he stood by the door. "Your offer is generous," she admitted after hearing the terms, "but I'm no longer certain selling is the right decision." Wallace frowned. "I understood you were eager to return east. Plans change, Mr. Wallace." "I should warn you," the banker said, his voice hardening slightly. "The bank in Silver Creek is not likely to extend your loans indefinitely. My clients are offering a clean break enough to pay your debts and start fresh elsewhere." Ethan stepped forward. "Miss Fontaine has until the end of spring to settle with the Silver Creek Bank. That was the agreement." Wallace glanced between them, his expression calculating. "And you are Ethan Quinn, ranch foreman." The banker smiled thinly. "Well, Mr. Quinn, Perhaps you should let Miss Fontaine consider what's best for her future. A struggling ranch is a burden few women can manage alone. She's not alone, Ethan said quietly. After Wallace departed with a promise to return in a month for her answer, Delilah turned to Ethan with confusion in her eyes. "Foreman," she questioned, "seemed simpler than explaining our arrangement." He met her gaze. "Unless you'd prefer I leave." The thought of Ethan leaving sent a cold spike of fear through her heart, a fear more potent than any she'd felt at the prospect of losing the ranch. "No," she said softly, "I wouldn't prefer that." That night, unable to sleep, Delilah sat on the porch watching stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. The sound of Ethan's footsteps on the wooden boards made her turn. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked. He shook his head, settling into the chair beside hers. "Too much on my mind." They sat in companionable silence for a time, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, distant cattle lowing, an owl calling from the trees, the gentle creaking of the windmill. "I don't want to sell," Delilah finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This land is in my blood." "It's all I have left of my family," Ethan nodded. "I figured as much, but I don't know if I can make it profitable enough to keep." "You can," he said with conviction. "The herd is growing. The spring calves are healthy. With some smart decisions, you could be turning a good profit by fall." She turned to look at him, her face silvered by moonlight. "Would you stay, to see it through?" "I'd stay for as long as you'd have me," he answered honestly. "But I think we both know it's not just about the ranch anymore." Delilah's heart hammered against her ribs. "I told you, Ethan, I can't love again." "Can't or won't," he challenged gently. "Does it matter? The result is the same." "It matters to me." He leaned forward, his eyes searching hers. "Because can't means you've lost the capacity. Won't means you're choosing safety over possibility." "And what's wrong with safety?" she demanded. "I've had enough grief to last a lifetime." "Nothing's wrong with it," he conceded, "except that it's not living, it's just existing." Delilah stood abruptly, moving to the porch railing. "You don't understand what it's like to lose everyone you've ever cared about, don't I?" His voice remained calm, but she heard the edge of pain. "My mother, my brother, my father, my partner all gone. Each loss tore a hole in me that I thought would never heal." He rose and came to stand beside her, not touching her but close enough that she could feel his warmth. "I rode from place to place for years, never staying long enough to care, until I came here." His voice softened. "Until I met you. And if I let myself care for you, truly care, what happens when you leave too?" Her voice broke on the question. "I'm not planning to leave, Delilah." "Neither was my father or my brother or Thomas," she countered. "Death doesn't care about plans." Ethan was quiet for a long moment. "So you'd rather feel nothing than risk the pain again?" "Exactly." "But that's not how it works," he said gently. "You already care. I can see it in your eyes every time you look at me. You're just refusing to admit it because you're scared." The truth of his words struck her like a physical blow. Tears welled in her eyes as the carefully constructed walls around her heart began to crumble. "I am scared," she whispered. Terrified, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Ethan reached for her hand. "I can't promise I'll never leave you, Delilah. No one can make that promise and keep it, but I can promise to love you fully for whatever time we have." A single tear slid down her cheek. "And if that's not enough?" "Then I'll love enough for both of us," he said, echoing his words from weeks before, "until you remember how to open your heart again." Something shifted inside her as she looked into his steadfast blue eyes, not a sudden revelation, but a slow awakening, like ice thawing in spring sunlight. The fear remained, but alongside it grew something else, something warm and fragile and hopeful. "I don't know if I can," she admitted. "You don't have to know now," he said, his thumb gently wiping away her tear. "We've got time." Under a sky full of stars, Delilah took the first tentative step toward him, allowing herself to be folded into his embrace. His arms around her felt like coming home after a long, cold journey. "One day at a time," he murmured against her hair. "One day at a time," she agreed. As spring turned to summer, the Broken Spoke Ranch flourished under their combined care. The cattle grew fat on abundant grass, the garden yielded a bountiful harvest, and repairs to the buildings continued steadily. When Wallace returned for his answer, Delilah firmly declined his offer, producing ledgers that showed the ranch's improving prospects. In July, Ethan moved from the bunkhouse to the main house, taking the small room that had once belonged to Delilah's brother. Their relationship evolved slowly, built on mutual respect and shared purpose before blossoming into deeper affection. One evening in late August, as they sat on the porch watching a spectacular sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Ethan took Delilah's hand. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice uncharacteristically nervous, "about the future." "What about it?" she asked, studying his face in the fading light. "About making things more permanent between us." He reached into his pocket and produced a small silver band, simple but beautifully crafted. "This was my mother's. I've carried it with me all these years, waiting for the right person." Delilah's breath caught as he held the ring between them. "I'm not asking for an answer today," he continued. "Just for you to consider it, to consider us a partnership in every sense." She looked down at the ring, then back to his face, the face that had become so dear to her over the months. The fear was still there, a shadow in her heart, but it no longer controlled her. "I don't need time," she said softly. "My answer is yes." Joy blazed in his eyes. "You're sure?" "I'm still scared," she admitted. "I'll probably always be a little afraid of losing what I love, but I've realized something these past months." She took a deep breath. "Living without love isn't really living at all." Ethan slid the ring onto her finger, then drew her close. "I promised to love enough for both of us," he reminded her, "but I don't think I'll need to anymore." "No," she agreed, resting her forehead against his, "but I'm grateful you did when I needed it most." They were married in October, when the aspen trees turned golden and the distant mountains wore their first dusting of snow. The small ceremony at the Silver Creek Church was attended by neighbors and the few friends they'd made. Afterwards, they returned to the Broken Spoke not as owner and foreman, but as equal partners in life and work. Years passed, bringing both joys and sorrows as all years do. They welcomed 2 children, a daughter with Delilah's dark eyes and determination, and a son with Ethan's easy smile and steady nature. They expanded the ranch, built a larger home, and earned a reputation for the finest cattle in the territory. There were hard times, 2 drought years, market crashes, and the winter their barn burned to the ground in a lightning strike. Through it all, they faced each challenge together, their bond only strengthening with each test. On their 10th anniversary, they stood together on the same porch where Ethan had first proposed, watching their children play in the yard that now boasted flowering bushes and a swing hanging from a sturdy oak. "Any regrets?" Ethan asked, his arm around her waist. Delilah leaned into his embrace, thinking of the frightened, closed-off woman she had been, and the life she might have missed had she not found the courage to love again. "Not one," she answered truthfully. "You kept your promise." "Which one?" he asked with a smile. "To love enough for both of us until I remembered how." She turned in his arms, her eyes meeting his. "Thank you for not giving up on me." "Never," he said simply, and kissed her as the Montana sunset painted the world in gold around them, a wealth far greater than either had ever dreamed of finding.